The winter of 1878 carried a stillness that clung to the valleys of Utah like a curse. The snow lay heavy across Cedar Valley, muffling every hoofbeat and distant sound, as if the land itself conspired to keep its secrets buried beneath layers of white silence. Into that frozen quiet came a traveling merchant named Jacob Hensworth, a man of modest frame and keen intelligence, his breath clouding the air as his horse labored through the frost-bitten trail. He carried a leather satchel bound in brass buckles, innocuous at first glance, yet heavy with the kind of truth that could unmake a family's name and history in a single afternoon. Inside that satchel lay genealogical records, certificates, correspondence, and handwritten notes that would unravel one of the most chilling family legacies ever documented on the American frontier. The contents did not tell of hauntings or demons in the traditional sense. What Jacob uncovered was something colder, something bred, not conjured. Within the Fairmont family line was a legacy of manipulation, cruelty, and blood-bound ambition so refined it had passed as nobility for more than 3 generations. The merchant's discovery would later be called one of the most disturbing revelations of frontier America, not for its superstition, but for the glimpse it offered into a darkness cultivated by human hands. The Fairmonts had been more than wealthy ranchers. They were engineers of social control, masters of deceit, and products of a lineage that had turned corruption into an inheritance. What began as a routine genealogical inquiry would end with the exposure of a family that had perfected the art of hiding atrocity behind respectability. Cedar Valley in those years was a small settlement of roughly 400 souls. The valley rested between blood-red cliffs and broad stretches of sagebrush that seemed to whisper in the wind like restless spirits. Founded by Mormon pioneers in the early 1850s, it had grown from a harsh camp of believers into a thriving agricultural community. By the late 1870s, the people of Cedar Valley took pride in their good fortune. Wheat fields stretched in gold bands across the plain, cattle grazed fat and docile, and church meetings filled the cold evenings with hymns of gratitude. But at the heart of it all stood the Fairmont family, untouched by the misfortunes that humbled others. Their sprawling estate spread across more than 3,000 acres of the most fertile land in the territory, a symbol of power visible from nearly every corner of the valley. The house itself, built of sandstone and shaped with symmetry rare for frontier architecture, sat high on a ridge overlooking the entire settlement. Its white fences and imported fruit trees were a spectacle of refinement, an oasis of cultivated beauty in the wilderness. The patriarch, Augustus Fairmont, was a man of commanding grace. His silver hair was always immaculately kept, his posture unbending, his speech measured and polished with the diction of European gentility. He claimed descent from the Fairmonts of Yorkshire, England, landed nobility whose blood, he insisted, coursed through his own veins. He displayed family crests, imported furnishings, and records tracing his ancestry back to the 17th century. The residents of Cedar Valley accepted these claims with admiration and awe. It was comforting to believe that civilization, in all its cultivated grace, had found a foothold in their remote corner of Utah. His wife, Elela Nina, embodied the same ideal. Her beauty and composure made her the unofficial queen of the settlement. She organized charity gatherings, oversaw women's aid groups, and ruled social functions with a soft-spoken authority that brooked no defiance. To outsiders, the Fairmonts represented refinement and order. To those within their orbit, they represented something closer to fear. Their children, Theodore, Marcus, and Isabel, were models of success. Theodore, the eldest, mirrored his father's business mind and ruthless charm. Marcus was the diplomat, known for his gift of persuasion and uncanny ability to secure every deal to the family's advantage. Isabel, admired across the territory for her beauty and manners, had married into a wealthy Salt Lake merchant family, expanding the Fairmont reach even further. The next generation was already being shaped in their image. Theodore's 17-year-old twins, Augustus Jr. and Victoria, and Marcus's son, Edgar, were spoken of as prodigies, intelligent beyond their years, composed beyond their youth. Neighbors called them gifted. Others, more quietly, called them unnatural. It wasn't only wealth that distinguished the Fairmonts. It was their unnatural immunity to tragedy. While other families buried infants or lost crops to blight, the Fairmonts flourished without interruption. Their livestock thrived, their harvests were abundant, and their ventures, no matter how risky, always succeeded. Even when disputes arose over land or water, outcomes unfailingly favored them. Opponents fell to ruin by a series of convenient misfortunes, illnesses, accidents, unexpected financial collapse. No one ever proved malice, yet suspicion lingered beneath the community's polite smiles. By 1878, the Fairmonts had built not just a home, but an empire of influence that reached far beyond Utah. Businessmen from Salt Lake, Denver, and San Francisco exchanged letters with Augustus, praising his insight and depending on his counsel. Yet beneath that correspondence lay a pattern invisible to those who saw only success. A quiet method by which the Fairmonts expanded, crushed, and consumed. When Jacob Hensworth arrived in Cedar Valley that February, no one expected his presence to matter. He was just another Easterner following paper trails for wealthy clients. Hensworth was a genealogical researcher from Philadelphia, tracing the lineage of a Pennsylvania estate contested by multiple heirs. His work had taken him across archives, courthouses, and dusty church records from Virginia to Illinois. But one claimant stood out, a man named Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley, Utah Territory. It was this name that drew him west. The estate in question was valued at over $50,000, a fortune that, if the Fairmont claim was false, would expose years of calculated deceit. The sight of the Fairmont estate startled him. In his journal, later recovered, Hensworth described the mansion as a fragment of Europe misplaced among red cliffs and desert wind. Inside, it was no less unsettling. Every detail of the home seemed carefully orchestrated. Walls lined with oil portraits, shelves stacked with imported books, and a faint scent of lavender and old paper hanging in the air. His first meeting with Augustus Fairmont was as cordial as expected. The patriarch greeted him with gracious civility, offering brandy and seating him beside the fire. For an hour, they discussed the estate claim, reviewing documents Augustus presented, a portfolio of birth certificates, marriage licenses, parish letters, all bearing the Fairmont seal. At a glance, they were impeccable. But to a trained researcher's eye, the cracks showed quickly. The parchment of supposed 18th century records was too uniform, the ink too fresh in tone. Several seals bore Latin spelling errors impossible for genuine clerical officials of the period. And most damning of all, handwriting across decades appeared identical. It was forgery of the highest order, masterful, but flawed. When Hensworth raised the inconsistencies with cautious diplomacy, the warmth in Augustus's eyes cooled like water turning to ice. He spoke of creative preservation and historical adjustments, suggesting that truth sometimes required flexibility. Beneath the polite phrasing lay a threat so refined it almost passed unnoticed. That evening, Hensworth dined with the entire family. The experience unsettled him more than the forged documents. The dinner table glowed under crystal lamps, servants moved in practiced silence, and conversation flowed like wine, elegant, rehearsed, precise. But behind each exchange flickered something sinister. The family's smiles seemed too deliberate, their laughter too measured. When one spoke, others exchanged glances layered with unspoken meaning. The younger Fairmonts were worst of all. Augustus Jr. and Victoria spoke like seasoned adults rather than teenagers, their words laced with an awareness too sharp for their years. When a neighbor's misfortune was mentioned, a farmer's sudden death, a widow's hardship, Victoria's response carried an indifference that chilled the air. Hensworth would later recall the moment as the first time he felt the full weight of the family's moral vacancy. Later that night, Augustus invited him back to the study. There, in the flickering firelight, the patriarch's mask slipped further. He spoke of the frontier as a proving ground for superior families, where weak bloodlines perished and the strong endured. He spoke of adaptability, not of the land, but of conscience. His words were polished, almost philosophical, yet their meaning was clear. Survival justified everything. When Hensworth returned to his boarding house, he discovered his satchel had been opened. Nothing was missing, but his papers were disturbed and the window unlatched. Someone had been there. The next morning brought a message delivered by one of the Fairmont ranch hands, a telegram claiming that Hensworth's mother in Philadelphia was gravely ill and calling for him to return home immediately. He knew it was a lie. He had received a cheerful letter from her just days before his journey west. The false message was a warning. Leave now, or something worse will follow. He pretended to comply, packing as though preparing to depart, but instead traveled to the county seat under cover of necessity. There, in courthouse ledgers and dusty archives, he found what the Fairmonts had hidden for 30 years. The family that arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 had not been named Fairmont at all. The documents listed them as Fleer, settlers from Missouri who had purchased land with suspicious sums of gold and bank drafts drawn from multiple states. Prior to their arrival, records linked them to unexplained deaths and financial scandals stretching across Missouri and Kansas. In Independence, Missouri, a merchant who had refused to sell his store to a man named Augustus Fleer died suddenly of heart failure despite being in perfect health. His widow, left destitute, sold the property to Fleer for a fraction of its worth. In Kansas, a farmer opposing them in a land dispute was thrown from his horse, crossing a bridge that had been weakened deliberately. In every town they touched, rivals met ruin or death, and the Fleers moved on unscathed. Tracing them further back, Hensworth found yet another name, Faulkner from Pennsylvania in the 1820s and 1830s. The same pattern appeared there. Business partnerships that ended in ruin for all but one side, neighbors dying in accidents, competitors suffering convenient tragedies. When he met with an aging former sheriff from that region, the man's recollections solidified Hensworth's growing horror. The sheriff spoke of the Faulkners as something less than human, calculating, watchful, devoid of empathy. Children trained from youth to manipulate others, taught to suppress emotion as weakness. He described one scene he'd never forgotten. A father forcing his 8-year-old son to watch as an injured horse was butchered alive, insisting the boy learn that sentimentality was a luxury for the weak. By 1843, the Faulkners had vanished from Pennsylvania just ahead of a grand jury investigation into fraudulent business dealings. They had reinvented themselves as the Fleers in Missouri, then the Fairmonts in Utah. Each name change was an act, a rebirth, new documents, new pasts, and a trail of ruined lives behind them. Hensworth's research revealed not a family cursed by madness, but one shaped deliberately for dominance. What others called evil, they considered strategy. They bred out compassion as if pruning a tree, cultivating in its place ambition, intellect, and a chilling indifference to human life. The realization left him shaken, but not broken. He returned to Cedar Valley with one purpose: to expose the truth. What awaited him there, however, would show that the Fairmont's capacity for control extended far beyond deception. When Jacob, Hensworth rode back into Cedar Valley under the guise of unfinished business. The snow had begun to thaw, leaving the roads slick with mud and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The community received him with polite curiosity, unaware that his pleasant smile hid the weight of what he already knew. He told anyone who asked that new documents had surfaced supporting the Fairmont claim to the Pennsylvania inheritance. Privately, he carried a conviction that if he could obtain physical proof linking the Fairmonts to their former lives as the Fleers and the Faulkners, the truth could finally be forced into daylight. Cedar Valley, seen through new eyes, no longer looked like an industrious frontier haven. It was a stage set, every figure moving in rhythm to the unseen pulse of the Fairmont family. Their presence was everywhere, in the church, in the trade routes, in the gossip that threaded through the marketplace. It was as though the valley itself bent around their estate, its people orbiting their influence like satellites around a dark sun. Hensworth began quietly documenting the history of those who had left the valley over the years. The local records told one story, the people told another. Dozens of families had vanished from Cedar Valley since the Fairmonts arrived. Some had supposedly moved to seek new land or business elsewhere, yet none of their names appeared in the records of the towns they were said to have joined. He started with the Morrison family, once prominent merchants whose eldest son had investigated grain shipments that mysteriously fell short in the territorial ledgers. The boy had died in what the papers called a hunting accident. The timing aligned too neatly with the week he was meant to present his findings to the authorities. His family left town shortly after, their store sold to the Fairmonts for a fraction of its worth. Next came the Caldwells, a family of blacksmiths whose patriarch descended into madness in the spring of 1872. Neighbors had whispered that he believed someone was poisoning his livestock. He ranted about strange figures on his property, unseen hands tampering with his wells. When his business collapsed, the shop was purchased by Theodore Fairmont. The community had pitied Caldwell, believing his mind had turned. Hensworth's notes framed a crueler possibility, that the man had been driven to insanity by deliberate manipulation. The pattern stretched on like a repeated cord. The Hartwells, proud farmers who once owned the most productive acreage in the valley, had challenged Fairmont control over grazing rights. Within months, their livestock sickened, their well turned foul, and their daughter was crippled in an inexplicable riding accident. By the following year, they were penniless, their land absorbed into the Fairmont holdings. Each case carried the same invisible signature. Misfortune visited only those who resisted, and every tragedy left the Fairmonts stronger. The pattern of control was too deliberate to be coincidence. But there were others who hadn't moved away at all. They had simply ceased to exist. The Petons, who ran the general store, were said to have relocated to California in 1869. Yet no record of their arrival existed anywhere west of Nevada. Their home had been left in perfect order, meals half prepared, a child's blanket folded on a chair. The Jenkins family, who had contested the Fairmont's water rights, vanished overnight, their crops left unharvested and their livestock wandering the fields. The official story claimed they'd gone to Colorado, but no one there had ever heard their names. The realization grew darker with every entry in Hensworth's notebook. The Fairmonts weren't simply exploiters, they were erasers. In search of something tangible, he sought out the oldest resident in the valley, Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, an ailing widow confined to her home, but known for her memory and her careful record-keeping. Her journals, bound in worn leather, filled with decades of notes about births, deaths, and everyday happenings in Cedar Valley, became his most vital source. When he first met her, the room smelled faintly of dust and camphor. Her hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages, but her mind was sharp. She spoke in whispers, as though the walls themselves might be listening. The Fairmonts, she said, kept watch over everything. They knew which families were struggling, who quarreled with whom, who owed money, whose children had fallen ill. They gathered gossip the way others collected valuables, and they used it with precision. Her writings detailed how the family's influence had spread like veins through stone. Businessmen were indebted to them. Church leaders sought their approval. Young couples depended on their loans to build homes. In return for these favors came silence. Silence about rumors, silence about disappearances, silence about fear. Then came her most chilling recollection. She told Hensworth that the Petons hadn't gone to California at all. A week after their supposed departure, she had seen Marcus Fairmont and two ranch hands guiding a wagon toward the old copper mines in the canyon. Something heavy had been loaded beneath a canvas top. When the wagon returned before dawn, the bed was empty and scrubbed clean. She had witnessed similar movements following the disappearance of the Jenkins family, lanterns flickering in the Hills long past midnight, men returning to the estate before sunrise. No one dared question them. The Fairmonts were beyond reproach, and those who had tried were already gone. Hensworth left Mrs. Sterling's home that evening with shaking hands and a conviction he could no longer suppress. The Fairmonts were not merely corrupt, they were killers. The next nights were restless. He felt watched wherever he went. In the tavern, conversation halted when he entered. On the street, silhouettes lingered just beyond the edge of lamplight. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Patterson, grew anxious, urging him to leave before he stirred more trouble. She had heard whispers, people saying he was prying into matters best forgotten. Then came a message delivered in the same polite tone as before. An invitation to dinner at the Fairmont estate. It arrived not from Augustus, but from his grandson, Augustus Jr. The young man's demeanor as he handed it over was unnervingly poised, his pale eyes betraying nothing. He inquired whether Hensworth had completed his research and if he had drawn any interesting conclusions about the family's lineage. The phrasing alone revealed the intent. The dinner would not be hospitality, it would be interrogation. He went nonetheless, determined to see their game through to the end. The second dinner in the great sandstone house carried an atmosphere entirely different from the first. The elegance remained, crystal, candlelight, the smell of imported wine, but beneath it pulsed an unspoken threat. Every member of the family was present, seated with the discipline of a tribunal. The conversation circled his investigation like vultures around a carcass. They asked about his employers, his purpose, his plans for publication. Their smiles never reached their eyes. The exchanges between them were subtle yet coordinated, each glance and gesture part of a wordless language. La Nena, seated at the head of the table beside her husband, played her role with exquisite skill. She spoke of community and trust, her tone as smooth as cream, yet every phrase reminded him that Cedar Valley was not a place for outsiders to question its harmony. Across the table, the younger Fairmonts observed him with clinical curiosity. Victoria's gaze lingered longer than was polite, her expression unreadable. Edgar, Marcus's son, asked casual questions about death and inheritance as if testing boundaries. There was no warmth in their faces, no hint of youthful innocence. Only calculation. The meal concluded with Augustus presenting what he called an arrangement. A portfolio of documents was placed before him, accompanied by a bank draft large enough to tempt any reasonable man. The patriarch framed it as compensation for his time, a gesture of goodwill. In exchange, he was to declare their lineage authenticated and end his research. The moment was silent but heavy. The offer wasn't a bribe, it was a verdict. Accept and live, refuse and vanish. Hensworth declined. The change in the room was immediate. The politeness remained, but the temperature dropped like a shadow passing over the sun. Augustus's voice stayed calm, yet his words turned precise and final. The family, he explained, had spent decades cultivating their standing. They would not allow misunderstandings to undo their legacy. Theodore, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, spoke next. His tone was casual, his phrasing deliberate. The frontier was dangerous, he reminded their guest. Accidents happened often. People went missing in the wilderness all the time. By the time Hensworth returned to his room at the boarding house, his decision felt like a death sentence already delivered. He found the door unlatched, his belongings scattered, his notes and copied records gone. The men who had searched had carried a warrant signed by the local justice, accusing him of fraud. Even the law, it seemed, answered to the Fairmonts. Mrs. Patterson begged him to leave while he still could. She had seen what happened to those who challenged the family's authority. He nodded, but inside he knew he could not go. The truth was too heavy to abandon, and his conscience too rigid to surrender. That night, as the moon rose over the ridges, he made his final plan. He would find what the Fairmonts hid in those abandoned mines, the graves Mrs. Sterling had hinted at. Proof undeniable, even if it cost him his life. The cold was bitter as he rode out of town. The mountains loomed black and silent, their outlines glinting with frost beneath the silver light. The path grew narrow and treacherous as it wound through the canyon, ending near the mouth of an old copper shaft half sealed with stones. Recent disturbances in the rubble confirmed what he already suspected. Someone had been here recently. He pried open the entrance and descended into darkness. The air was thick, carrying a stench that turned the stomach, decay masked by lime. His lantern's glow revealed a cavern of horror. Within the mine were human remains, bones arranged in grim order, clothing remnants clinging to the damp earth. Among them lay tokens recognizable even to an outsider. A child's ribbon, a wedding ring engraved with initials, a cracked pocket watch frozen in time. The faces of the vanished families stared back at him through the objects they had left behind. In one corner, buried beneath stones, he found something wrapped in oiled cloth, a ledger bound in leather. Its pages filled in Augustus Fairmont's distinct, meticulous handwriting. The entries catalogued death with the efficiency of bookkeeping, names, dates, methods, and reasons. Each victim listed not as a person, but as an obstacle removed. The words blurred before his eyes as he read. Robert Caldwell, arsenic administered gradually. Necessary for family security. Jenkins family, chloroform followed by disposal. Prevention of legal complication. James Morrison, staged hunting accident. Maintenance of government contract. 30 names in all. 30 calculated murders cloaked beneath 3 decades of prosperity. As Hensworth traced his fingers over the ink, he felt the enormity of the deception pressed down on him. The Fairmonts had not merely manipulated their neighbors, they had cultivated murder into a discipline. Then came the sound, the crunch of boots outside the mine, voices echoing against the rock walls. He recognized the tone instantly, calm, refined, the same voice that had offered him brandy and civility days before. Augustus Fairmont had come to finish what his ledger had begun. The voices drifted down the shaft like wind through a graveyard, low, deliberate, echoing against the stone. Jacob Hensworth pressed himself into the shadows of the tunnel, his lantern extinguished, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Above the scrape of boots came the unmistakable rhythm of authority, a voice carrying calm command. Augustus Fairmont, unhurried as ever, speaking as though this were nothing more than business. The words reached him in fragments, phrases carried on the cold air. The genealogist has proven more resourceful than anticipated. His investigation has exceeded acceptable parameters. His refusal to cooperate indicates a permanent threat to family security. The tone was matter-of-fact, absent of rage or urgency, the voice of a man discussing inventory, not murder. Jacob's mind raced. There was only one exit, the one they were blocking. The deeper tunnels collapsed years ago. He had no escape. The lantern beside him flickered faintly, threatening to betray him if it reignited. His breath clouded in the chill. Somewhere above, stones shifted beneath careful feet. He looked at the ledger again, the inked pages glistening under the faint residue of lamplight. This book was his only weapon, proof undeniable. He tore several pages loose, folding them tight and sealing them into the lining of his coat. The remainder he tucked behind a rock ledge, wrapping it once more in the oiled cloth. If he were caught, perhaps the record would survive. A voice closer now, Theodore's, heavy and sure. They were entering the shaft. Another voice, Marcus's, quieter, colder. The sound of metal scraping against stone followed, the click of a revolver being checked. Then Augustus spoke again, his tone nearly kind. The genealogist has entered the family's history more deeply than intended. His understanding must be contained. Jacob moved deeper into the side tunnel, crawling on hands and knees through the narrow gap where part of the ceiling had collapsed. Pebbles fell around him, scattering down the slope. The faint light from the mine entrance grew distant. Behind him, boots crunched. His shoulder brushed the damp wall, leaving a smear of sweat on stone. He forced himself forward, breath shallow, heart hammering. The passage tightened. His coat snagged against jagged rock. He tore it free, feeling fabric rip, the folded papers pressing against his ribs like a heartbeat of their own. His hands met emptiness. The tunnel opened slightly into a side chamber, black as ink. He crouched there, trying to steady his breathing. The footsteps grew louder. Voices echoed faintly down the shaft. The family spoke in calm coordination, dividing paths, discussing angles of approach. They were practiced hunters. This wasn't their first pursuit. The silence broke with Augustus's measured tone. Mr. Hensworth's passion for discovery has put him in danger. His disappearance must appear accidental. A chill ran through Jacob's spine at the phrasing. Disappearance. Not death, not murder, just another item to be catalogued. Another entry in that damned ledger. He could almost see the new line written in neat script. Jacob Hensworth, March 1st, 1878. Mine shaft collapsed during unauthorized exploration. Elimination required to preserve family secrecy. Rocks shifted nearby. Dust filled the air. The faint orange glow of a lantern appeared around the bend. For a moment, the light revealed faces. Theodore's angular and stern, Marcus's expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, Augustus's calm profile framed in shadow. Their precision terrified Jacob more than any overt violence could. These men killed without emotion, without the burden of conscience. He waited until they drew closer, then moved silently into the adjoining tunnel, his boots sliding over damp gravel. He followed a narrow fissure upward toward a section where the mine had partially collapsed. Above him, a faint sliver of moonlight cut through a crack in the rocks. Salvation or a trap? Before he could reach it, stones shifted behind him. A hand seized his shoulder. The grip was iron. Theodore's voice emerged from the darkness, cold as the air between them. Jacob turned sharply, wrenching free and striking out blindly. His hand connected with flesh, then bone. Theodore staggered, cursing. Jacob didn't wait. He scrambled upward, pulling himself toward the faint light. Shouts echoed behind him, Marcus calling orders, Augustus instructing calm. He reached the break in the rock just as a gunshot tore through the tunnel. The sound deafened him, reverberating off the walls. A shower of pebbles rained down. Another shot cracked through the air, and the edge of his coat shredded under the impact. He forced himself through the opening, clawing at the rock until his hands bled, and emerged into the cold night above. He reached the break in the rock just as a gunshot tore through the tunnel. The sound deafened him, reverberating off the walls. A shower of pebbles rained down. Another shot cracked through the air, and the edge of his coat shredded under the impact. He forced himself through the opening, clawing at the rock until his hands bled, and emerged into the cold night above. The canyon stretched below. Washed in moonlight, the Fairmont estate a distant silhouette against the horizon. For a moment the stars looked almost merciful, but mercy didn't exist in Cedar Valley. He staggered a few feet from the entrance before stopping. Breath ragged, chest burning, voices rose behind him again. They were climbing out. He had no horse, no weapon, nowhere to hide. The canyon walls loomed like dark sentinels, trapping him in their arms. Then another sound, one he hadn't expected. The echo of hoofbeats approaching from the opposite ridge, lanterns bobbing, a man's voice calling his name. At first he thought it was a trick, another layer of the family's deception. But then came the unmistakable tone of authority, the clipped accent of law enforcement. Territorial Sheriff Thomas Bradley, a name he had seen once on official correspondence. Behind him, a smaller figure dismounted, a woman's silhouette against the lantern light. Mrs. Sterling, frail yet unyielding, clutching the arm of the sheriff as though she had summoned him from the depths of her fear. The sheriff's shout rang across the canyon, his command echoing into the mine. Augustus Fairmont, by order of the Territorial Court, you are under arrest in connection with multiple missing persons and acts of criminal conspiracy. The effect was instantaneous. Inside the mine, movement froze. The calm precision that had guided the Fairmonts faltered for the first time. Augustus's reply was measured but thinly veiled with calculation. He began negotiating, his voice smooth, seeking to control even this moment. Jacob watched from the rocks above as the standoff unfolded. The sheriff's men surrounded the entrance, their lanterns flickering like a ring of judgment. For nearly an hour, words traded back and forth, bribes offered, threats implied. The Fairmont patriarch struggling to maintain the composure that had ruled his life. When the family finally emerged, it was not in surrender but in resignation. Augustus came first. his silver hair illuminated by the lantern glow, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Theodore and Marcus descended the slope in silence, followed by two of their ranch hands, whose faces betrayed the first cracks of fear. The sheriff's deputies moved in quickly, binding their wrists. The entire scene unfolded with eerie calm, as though even capture had been foreseen in the Fairmont calculations. Only Victoria, the young daughter, resisted. Her eyes burned with hatred so pure it seemed ancient, her voice hissing curses as deputies restrained her. Jacob stood motionless, exhaustion hollowing him from within. The moon hung cold above the canyon, casting light on the family who had ruled Cedar Valley like gods. Now they looked smaller, their fine clothes covered in dust, their arrogance crumbling beneath the weight of exposure. The sheriff led them back toward the valley at dawn. The news spread faster than the rising sun. By midday, the Fairmont estate was surrounded. Curious onlookers, horrified townsfolk, and silent neighbors who had lived decades under their dominion. The search that followed confirmed everything the ledger had promised and more. Beneath the main house, investigators discovered hidden compartments filled with forged documents, birth records, passports, noble seals, all constructed to maintain the illusion of aristocracy. Locked drawers contained vials of poison, chemical compounds labeled only with numbers, and detailed notes on dosage and effect. The cellar revealed the worst of it. Behind a false wall, a laboratory had been built, glass instruments, preserved samples, even anatomical sketches annotated in Augustus's meticulous script. They had studied the human body with the same precision they applied to manipulation. Murder was not savagery to them. It was science. Out in the canyons, more graves were found. Old mine shafts sealed with care, each concealing the bones of families long forgotten. Among them, fragments of clothing, jewelry, and tools identified by tearful survivors. The list of victims grew until it filled pages. Merchants, farmers, women, children. Entire bloodlines erased. Jacob's evidence, the torn pages hidden in his coat, the photographs he had managed to take before the confrontation, became the cornerstone of the case. Sheriff Bradley's men recovered the ledger from the mine and the Fairmont archives from the estate. Together they painted a portrait of evil that defied explanation. When the trial began in Salt Lake City that summer, newspapers from across the country sent correspondents to cover it. The public devoured every word. The Fairmonts, who had posed as models of civilization, were now paraded as architects of corruption. Their wealth, their refinement, their bloodline, all illusions built on bones. Witnesses from Cedar Valley filled the courtroom. Mrs. Sterling testified first, her frail voice steady as she described the nights she had watched wagons vanish into the canyons. Others spoke of lost family, poisoned wells, ruined crops, of how they had lived under invisible rule without ever naming their fear. Then came the evidence, the ledger itself, read aloud by the prosecution. Each entry a confession dressed in accounting language, each victim reduced to a note on profit and loss. The courtroom fell silent as the final page was read, the words inked with mechanical precision. Necessary eliminations preserve order. Weakness, once tolerated, breeds decay. The Fairmont's demeanor throughout the proceedings unnerved everyone present. Augustus sat composed, answering questions with calm intelligence, his tone that of a man defending an ideology rather than confessing to crimes. He spoke of natural selection, of superior bloodlines destined to rule the lesser. His sons mirrored his confidence, their eyes void of remorse. Even the younger ones seemed incapable of understanding the horror they represented. When Elena finally spoke, the courtroom hushed. She described their practices as education, their conditioning of children as refinement. They taught them to suppress emotion, she explained, to act with clarity unclouded by sentiment. The audience listened, unable to decide which was worse, the acts themselves or the serene conviction with which she described them. Victoria's testimony was brief and chilling. When asked if she regretted the deaths of those who had opposed her family, she seemed confused. They were obstacles, she answered. Removing obstacles is rational. The verdict came swiftly. The adult Fairmonts, Augustus, Elena, Theodore, and Marcus, were sentenced to hang. The younger members, deemed minors, were sent to reform institutions, though reports later suggested that rehabilitation proved nearly impossible. Their understanding of morality had been erased before it ever formed. In the aftermath, Cedar Valley struggled to cleanse itself of their shadow. The estate was seized and dismantled, the mineshaft sealed, a memorial erected to honor the vanished families. Yet even as the dust settled, unease remained. The people whispered that evil, that deliberate, never truly dies. It hides, changes its name, and waits. For Jacob Hensworth, the ordeal marked a turning point that divided his life into before and after. He returned east a different man, his once gentle curiosity hardened into grim purpose. The ledger's images haunted his sleep. He began dedicating his work to unmasking those who used false lineage as camouflage for cruelty. His writings would help birth an entirely new discipline, what future generations would call criminal psychology. The book he later published, The Fairmont Deception, a true account of America's most dangerous family, became both record and warning. It told not just the story of a murderous dynasty, but of how easily civilization's veneer can mask predation. He never forgot the faces in that mine, the people reduced to ledger entries. Nor could he forget the moment he saw Augustus Fairmont for what he truly was. Not a monster of myth, but a human being stripped of empathy, shaped by generations of deliberate design. Some years later, when asked whether he believed the Fairmont family had been unique, Hensworth answered with a silence that spoke volumes. Because in his research, he had already begun to see patterns repeating, different names, different towns, the same cold precision, and deep down, he feared that Cedar Valley had merely been one chapter in a larger story, one that might still be unfolding in other valleys, other generations beneath the calm surface of respectable families who smiled too perfectly and failed too rarely. The hanging of the Fairmonts took place at dawn on an August morning in 1878. The air was heavy and windless, the kind of stillness that seems to pause the world in anticipation. Outside the Salt Lake City courthouse, a crowd had gathered before sunrise. Farmers, merchants, curious travelers, and reporters from as far east as New York and Philadelphia. They came not only to witness justice but to confront the unthinkable truth that had seeped into the national imagination. That an entire family could live among good people, smiling, trading, worshipping, while quietly murdering those who stood in their way. The scaffold stood stark against the pale horizon. 4 ropes swayed slightly in the morning breeze. Guards escorted the condemned through the courtyard. Augustus, dignified as ever, his silver hair uncombed but his posture unbroken. Elena, her expression distant, as though she were observing the moment from some higher plane. Theodore and Marcus silent, eyes fixed ahead. They were unshaken, almost serene. Reporters noted that none prayed, none begged. Augustus gazed at the crowd as if addressing a boardroom rather than facing death. His final words, delivered in the same cultured cadence that had once charmed a valley, were later printed in nearly every major paper in the country. Humanity's weakness, he declared, was its sentimental attachment to equality. Nature rewards strength, not pity. History would prove them right. Moments later, the trapdoors fell. The execution marked the official end of the Fairmont dynasty, but its shadow spread far beyond the gallows. Within days, papers across America carried lurid headlines: the cult of the Fairmonts, the nobility of murder, the devil's genealogy. People read in fascination and revulsion, unable to reconcile the family's refinement with their monstrous acts. Some saw them as aberrations, others as symbols of deeper corruption within the American experiment itself. A warning that beneath every civilized facade, the savage still waited. In Cedar Valley, news of the execution arrived with a mixture of relief and dread. For weeks, the town had lived under the scrutiny of outsiders, journalists, investigators, opportunists looking to profit from tragedy. The once proud estate had become a macabre pilgrimage site. Locals whispered that strange lights still flickered in the abandoned mansion, though the authorities had sealed it off. Others swore that the soil on the property grew nothing now, as though the land itself rejected life. For the survivors, rebuilding was not merely a matter of restoring farms or homes. It was the slow, painful work of learning to trust again. Decades of manipulation had twisted the fabric of the community until no one knew where loyalty ended and fear began. Neighbors who had once dined together now avoided each other in the street, uncertain who might have been complicit, who had benefited, who had looked away. Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling lived just long enough to see the memorial erected, a simple stone column at the edge of the valley, engraved with the names of those confirmed dead, and a longer list marked only as missing. She died quietly that winter, her journals sealed in the county archives alongside Hensworth's report. Her testimony became the moral spine of the Fairmont case, a reminder that evil often survives because good people convince themselves it's impolite to name it. As the years passed, Cedar Valley changed. The Fairmont house was dismantled, its stones repurposed for new homes and barns. The fields where they once held their harvest celebrations became public grazing land. But no family ever built on the hill again. Children grew up hearing stories whispered in the dark about the Fairmont ghosts, the ones who never left because they didn't know how to feel remorse. For Jacob Hensworth, the trial's conclusion was not triumph. It was exhaustion. His testimony had secured the convictions, but at a cost he could barely measure. The nights brought dreams of the mine shaft, the stillness of the bones, the smell of lime, the echo of calm voices plotting death as though it were mathematics. He returned to Philadelphia that autumn, thinner, grayer, a man aged by what he had seen. His mother barely recognized him at first. He spent weeks in near silence, avoiding company, walking alone through the narrow cobblestone streets where he'd grown up. He had exposed monsters, yet what haunted him most was their composure. There had been no wild madness in the Fairmonts, no frenzy of violence, only reason sharpened into something inhuman. Over time, he began writing. At first, it was a means of exorcism, private notes meant to keep his mind from collapsing under the weight of memory. But the notes grew into chapters, the chapters into analysis. He corresponded with academics, psychologists, criminologists still defining their field. What emerged was more than a case study. It was an anatomy of evil. In 1879, he published The Fairmont Deception, a true account of America's most dangerous family. The book was an immediate sensation. Reviewers called it both horrifying and enlightening, a mirror held up to the moral pretensions of a nation racing toward progress while ignoring the rot beneath. It sold tens of thousands of copies in its first year, making Hensworth one of the most discussed men in the country. But fame brought little comfort. Every interview reopened the wound. People asked him to describe the family's faces, their voices, their final words. Some asked whether he believed evil was born or made. He never answered directly. To him, the Fairmonts had been proof that nurture could sculpt monsters more effectively than nature ever could. They had refined immorality into inheritance. The book influenced more than public opinion. It inspired lawmakers to create new systems for verifying identity, new methods for tracking inheritance claims across territories. Genealogical fraud became a recognized crime. Hensworth's research even reached university circles, where professors dissected his theories on learned amorality, how entire generations could be trained to suppress empathy through conditioning. Yet the more his ideas spread, the more isolated he became. Friends found him distant, preoccupied. He avoided gatherings, rarely smiled, and when he spoke of Cedar Valley, his voice grew quiet and cold. Some said he feared that descendants of the Fairmont line might still exist, scattered and waiting to begin anew. In his later papers, never published during his lifetime, he hinted at discoveries suggesting the family's reach may have extended further than anyone realized. Letters found among the Fairmont documents contained references to other names, different identities established in other territories, potential associates who shared their philosophy. The handwriting varied, but the tone was identical, efficient, calculating, detached. It was possible, he feared, that the Fairmonts had not been the originators of their methods, but students of an older, hidden tradition, a culture of calculated cruelty passed quietly through generations of ambitious families who viewed morality as a disadvantage. The thought consumed him. Throughout the 1880s, Hensworth continued to lecture, urging scholars to examine patterns of intergenerational manipulation. He spoke of families who treated empathy as disease, of communities too naive to recognize predation disguised as grace. His lectures drew crowds but also unease. Some accused him of paranoia, of seeing conspiracies where none existed. But those who heard him in person described a conviction too intense to dismiss. He would pace the stage, voice low and deliberate, describing how charm can function as camouflage, how institutions often protect the powerful because they appear civilized. He would describe Cedar Valley in detail, the estate gleaming in sunlight, the children smiling, the neighbors praising their generosity, all while beneath the soil, the bones multiplied. By the late 1880s, he had withdrawn from public view. The fame he never sought faded quickly, replaced by speculation about his reclusiveness. Some said he suffered from melancholia, others from what modern minds might call trauma. He wrote seldom, but his private notebooks revealed a mind haunted not by ghosts, but by patterns. He began cross-referencing disappearances across the Western Territories, entire families whose names vanished from census rolls without explanation. His annotations were precise, a red mark beside each cluster of vanishings, a notation reading possible replication. In one letter to a colleague, he described visiting a small settlement in Colorado where rumors persisted of a prominent family with Eastern roots who displayed eerie parallels to the Fairmont legacy. Charitable, well-bred, always prosperous, and untouched by tragedy. He wrote that their eldest son had eyes too calm for a boy of 16. The letter ended abruptly, with a single line beneath the signature, "It begins again." He never published those findings. Some believed the letter was dramatization. Others thought it a warning. A few suggested that he had gone too far into his own theories, blurring the line between vigilance and obsession. Whatever the truth, by the time of his death in 1892, Jacob Hensworth had become a solitary figure, remembered as both hero and ghost hunter. A man who had exposed one evil only to spend the rest of his life searching for its shadow. In the years following his death, the Fairmont deception fell into obscurity, resurfacing only occasionally in academic discussions. But the story refused to vanish entirely. Historians revisited it, criminologists studied it, and in each retelling, the Fairmonts became less like a historical family and more like an archetype, a warning about how human evil survives not through chaos, but through control. Even now, the questions Hensworth raised linger unanswered. Was the family's cruelty born of blood, as Augustus had claimed, or was it the result of meticulous conditioning, a human experiment in removing conscience from lineage? Were they unique, or part of something broader, a network of minds who believed morality was weakness? Cedar Valley never fully escaped its infamy. Generations later, farmers still found old tools rusted in the soil, unmarked graves unearthed by floods. Children dared one another to climb the ridge where the mansion once stood. They said that on clear nights, when the wind moved through the sage, you could hear faint voices reciting something like prayers, but colder, emptier, as if addressed to nothing human. In 1901, a historian named Edwin Clark returned to the site to document what remained. He described the landscape as eerily quiet, devoid of birds or insects. Locals warned him not to stay after dark. He ignored them. That night, he claimed to have seen light flickering near the old mine entrance, steady, purposeful, like someone walking with a lantern. When he approached, it vanished. The next morning, he found a single object lying in the dust, a rusted pocket watch engraved with the initials AF. Whether the story was true or born of superstition mattered little. By then, the Fairmonts had become folklore. To some, they represented the devil clothed in civility. To others, they symbolized the danger of inherited power, the idea that refinement could conceal rot so deep it no longer recognized itself as evil. And somewhere, beneath the soil of Cedar Valley, the last remnants of their world remained sealed, the ledger, the bones, and the echo of a philosophy too precise to die. More than a century has passed since the Fairmont family vanished from history's living memory, and yet their story never truly died. It lingered, half forgotten in archives and whispered across generations like a wound that refused to heal. For years, their name lay buried beneath dust and polite silence, until scholars and storytellers began unearthing it once again, each finding in their crimes not just horror, but reflection. The Fairmonts had been gone for over 100 years when America learned to speak the language of psychology. Only then did people begin to understand what Jacob Hensworth had glimpsed in those cold Utah canyons, that the human mind could be cultivated toward darkness as easily as toward light. The family's atrocities, once viewed as isolated madness, became case studies in manipulation, control, and generational conditioning. But what unsettled those who revisited the case was how modern it all felt. The facade of respectability, the curated image, the quiet elimination of opposition, it was not confined to the 19th century. It was a blueprint. The deeper researchers delved, the more the line between myth and history blurred. In 1926, a psychologist named Dr. Edwin Forsyth uncovered surviving pages of Hensworth's notes. The papers, thought lost, contained details that never appeared in his published book. Letters referencing additional families, records of financial transfers between the Fairmont estate and unidentified accounts in Missouri and Kansas. Some letters bore different signatures, but were written in a nearly identical hand. Forsyth concluded that the Fairmont family network might have extended far beyond Utah, possibly as part of a larger pattern of controlled identities spanning generations. He published his findings in a journal titled The Anatomy of Influence. His peers dismissed it as paranoia, accusing him of mistaking coincidence for conspiracy. Yet months after the article's release, Forsyth's career ended abruptly. His funding disappeared, his lectures were cancelled, and he withdrew from public life. He died in 1931. His personal papers confiscated by state authorities investigating mental instability. His conclusions were buried, his reputation erased. Decades later, his notes surfaced again, found among the possessions of a deceased librarian in Boston who had devoted her life to tracing old genealogies. In the margins of Forsyth's manuscripts were annotations in her handwriting. It continues. Those words reignited curiosity, especially among historians of crime. During the 1950s and 60s, researchers began drawing parallels between the Fairmonts and later families whose influence spread through isolated American communities, dynasties of wealth and power that avoided scrutiny through charm and social control. Some even proposed that descendants of the original Fairmont line had survived, adopting new names, rebuilding their methods in quieter forms. Of course, such theories were impossible to prove. The evidence was scattered, contradictory, and often lost to fires, floods, or misfiling. But every generation seemed to bring a new whisper, a new resemblance. In 1972, a journalist named Caroline Rowe published an investigative series on small-town disappearances in the western states. She traced more than 30 cases involving entire families who had relocated suddenly, leaving property behind. Many of the communities shared the same pattern. One prominent household, always respected, always prosperous, untouched by hardship, standing at the center of it all. Her work was never completed. She disappeared that autumn while traveling through northern Nevada, her car found abandoned on a dirt road. The notes in her trunk mentioned only 2 words: Cedar Valley. Her disappearance revived the myth in a way no academic study ever could. Talk radio hosts, pulp writers, and television specials all rediscovered the Fairmonts. They became a symbol of the American nightmare, the perfect family hiding something monstrous beneath their refinement. For true historians, the legend presented a frustrating puzzle. No clear photographs survived, no reliable portraits. The mansion was gone, its stones scattered into new homes. The official trial transcripts vanished from state archives during a relocation in the 1890s. What remained were fragments, letters, copies of court proceedings, and Hensworth's first edition, now brittle and rare. Still, fragments can tell a story. The ledger entries, those chilling lines written in Augustus Fairmont's own hand, remained intact, now displayed in a small museum in Salt Lake City. Visitors often describe a strange unease in its presence, as if the handwriting itself carried intention. One curator confessed that the ink appeared darker every year, as though it refused to fade. Psychologists continue to dissect the Fairmont philosophy, calling it applied moral inversion. Augustus had described humanity as a resource hierarchy, empathy as waste, emotion as flaw. What disturbed scholars most was not the philosophy itself. It echoed ancient tyrannies, but the efficiency with which it had been taught to children. Within that family, cruelty was not a deviation, it was discipline. In modern times, genetic studies have sought to answer the question Hensworth himself wrestled with. Were the Fairmonts born evil or made that way? Science now suggests that behavior is rarely inherited whole, yet culture, repeated, reinforced, justified, can behave like a gene, passed down, shaping the next generation, mutating into new forms. In that sense, the Fairmonts were not unique. They were simply early practitioners of something civilization would later perfect: the art of wearing masks. Cedar Valley today bears little resemblance to the town Jacob Hensworth once rode into. The population barely reaches 200. The descendants of settlers still work the soil, but the air holds a quiet superstition. At dusk, locals avoid the ridge where the estate once stood. They claim the land there hums faintly after sundown, as if vibrating with buried memory. Few outsiders visit, and those who do often describe a sense of being observed, even in silence. In the archives of the Utah Historical Society, an anonymous letter arrived in 2009, postmarked from an unknown sender. It contained a single photograph, sepia-toned, undated. The image showed a family of 6 standing before a large stone house. The adults wore 19th century clothing, the children neatly dressed. On the back, written in fading ink, Fairmont, 1878. Forensic analysts found inconsistencies in the photo's age. The ink was modern, the paper too new, but the image itself was old. Too old to have been fabricated easily. Most unsettling of all was the background. Behind the family stood not Cedar Valley, but a landscape no one could identify. Red cliffs, yes, but sharper, more barren. Perhaps somewhere else entirely. The letter included no explanation, only a second line, handwritten beneath the name, "We Endure." Authorities dismissed it as a hoax. Yet a historian who handled the photograph later claimed that the woman's face, the supposed Elanina Fairmont, did not match any known description of her. The expression was wrong, the smile too slight. Some argued that the photo wasn't of the past at all, but of a family imitating it. Whether genuine or not, the image reignited the myth once more. In the digital age, stories like this travel faster than reason. Forums and conspiracy channels began collecting alleged sightings, reports of families with the Fairmont signature. Those who prosper without loss, whose charm conceals something colder. None have been proven, but the legend persists. Perhaps it endures because it touches something primal. The fear that evil is not chaos, but calculation. That the worst among us are not beasts in the wild, but well-mannered, articulate, confident. The kind who look you in the eye and make you feel safe, even as they decide your fate. The Fairmont story endures because it is not only history, it is reflection. It asks whether civilization truly tames us, or merely teaches us to hide what we've always been. Scholars studying Hensworth's later life note that in his final years, he began keeping one last journal, a private volume never meant for publication. It was found decades later in a locked drawer of his Philadelphia home, its cover worn, its ink faded by time. Inside were pages of analysis, observations of human behavior, and scattered throughout, brief entries written in a tone unlike his usual careful prose. They read more like confessions than notes. They were not supernatural, one line said. That was the comfort I once sought. To believe they were something apart, but they were not. They were human, refined, focused, patient. The flaw was not in their blood, but in their success. Another entry near the end bore no date. I have seen their pattern too many times to believe they are gone. Names change, faces change, the philosophy remains. Some bloodlines simply hide longer than others. After that, his writing stopped. The rest of the pages were blank. In 2017, a group of researchers digitizing historical records from the late 19th century uncovered a small bundle of letters filed under pseudonymous identities, people who had claimed inheritance from estates in different territories. Each document used handwriting strikingly similar to the Fairmont forgeries. None were ever collected or claimed. Each bore a return address that no longer existed. It might have been coincidence, a quirk of history repeating itself. Or it might have been proof that the lineage Hensworth feared did not die at the gallows but adapted, as the family always had. Even now, those who visit Cedar Valley sometimes report strange details. Lanterns seen moving in the distance though no one walks the ridges. Footprints appearing overnight on the sealed mine path. Once, in 2021, a pair of hikers camping near the old site claimed to have heard voices in the wind, measured, formal, almost conversational. When they returned to town, they discovered their camera had erased every photograph taken after midnight. Such tales might be superstition. But the legend of the Fairmonts was born from the same soil, stories too absurd to believe until they were proven real. What remains undeniable is the power of what they left behind. Their legacy exists not in blood or bone, but in the quiet fear they planted in the collective imagination. The fear that evil does not always announce itself, that it can be educated, elegant, and generational. Perhaps that is why their story still resonates. Because somewhere, deep down, people recognize themselves in the reflection. The desire for power, the pride in lineage, the subtle comfort of believing oneself better than others. The Fairmonts had simply stripped those impulses of their disguise. When historians speak of them now, they do so with caution, as though invoking something contagious. Museums refuse to display their artifacts without protective glass. The original ledger, its ink still unnervingly vivid, rests in a climate-controlled vault, its pages too fragile to turn. And yet, despite all precautions, those who've handled it report the same experience. A lingering unease, a sense that the words within it are less history than prophecy. Jacob Hensworth once wrote that the true horror of the Fairmonts was not their murders, but their clarity. They did not kill out of rage or passion, but logic. To them, human life was a variable to be adjusted, an equation to balance. It is easy to condemn them as monsters from a distant century. Harder to recognize the echo of their reasoning in the modern world. In boardrooms, in politics, in every system that rewards efficiency over empathy. Civilization has grown more complex, but its hungers remain the same. So perhaps the Fairmonts were not an aberration. Perhaps they were the inevitable outcome of progress without conscience. As the night deepens over Cedar Valley, the wind threads through the sage and sandstone, carrying the faint scent of dust and iron. Somewhere beneath that soil lie the remains of those who trusted refinement over instinct, and the bones of those who mistook civility for virtue. The land remembers what the living prefer to forget. The stars above are unchanged since the winter, when Jacob Hensworth first arrived, chasing documents and finding damnation. And though the house is gone, and the names erased, the story endures. Because it is not only about them, it is about what people can become when morality is treated as inconvenience. In the silence between gusts of wind, it's easy to imagine footsteps in the distance. A calm, deliberate stride, a voice cultured and persuasive, speaking of legacy, of superiority, of order. The kind of voice that once made entire communities listen and believe. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of the world, someone still does.